Okay, students, today we're looking at the development of the Cold War and the key um, ideas and how it started. How did this war develop? And we call it the Cold War because uh, this kind of explosion did not happen over New York City or Moscow. But how did that come to be? What's the process where this tension came to exist between the US and the Soviet Union? And how did it play out? How did this tension come to be so that it never came to an actual war? So let's look through this. After World War II, there's a new balance of power. You have the United States versus the USSR. Okay. Now, Britain is also one of the big three in the Allies, except that the war really weakened Britain a lot. Their empire is barely holding together. Britain's main concern is rebuilding. They were really bombed out a lot by the war, through the Battle of Britain, through bombings that Germany made on them. They're barely holding it together. So they have an empire, but they're fairly weak. They're barely holding on to it. The two powers that are the strongest is the United States and the Soviet Union by the end of the war. And they both have completely different governments, completely different economic systems, totally different ideologies. The US is a capitalist democracy, and the Soviet Union is a communist dictatorship. And both have this idea that you should expand. Communism, doctrinaire communism says you have to expand, the whole world should be communist. And it's the only way to be safe from the evil or bourgeoisie. And they begin to talk about the Iron Curtain. So this is from the Churchill speech that you read, where Churchill talked about the status quo, the fact that at the time, areas that the Soviets controlled after World War II were very limited. There's a lot of restricted freedom there. And he called it the Iron Curtain, and this became a phrase that people use. So with World War II, the Soviets expanded, they took all this area away from the Germans, and they expanded into Germany. And this is kind of as far as they got. And then the Allies got this far, they took over this area. And there wasn't really a lot of agreement on how the future should go. So the US and Britain wanted free elections. They said, well, after the war, let Poland and let them make their own governments again and be free again. And the Soviets said, yeah, but no, not really, because if they have a free election, they're going to elect a anti-communist government, and we can't allow that. So what the Soviets did is they didn't really leave their influence here. They forced these countries to become communist dictatorships, and they had to do whatever the Soviets directed. So Yugoslavia also is a communist country, Albania, a little bit more independent of the Soviets than the other ones were, but anyway. And then in blue are countries that were not really part of the communist bloc. Now, another key idea to note is containment. This developed out of the 1940s to say that, well, don't want another big war again. So if there's a communist country, just let it stay communist, like let them be, but it cannot expand. If democracies can use their power to keep communism from expanding, that would be a good thing. Adding to that is the Truman Doctrine. Harry Truman, pictured here, he became president of the US after Roosevelt died. He said, basically, containment is America's foreign policy. And besides that, the US would actively support anyone who was facing a communist takeover. When he said this, when the Truman Doctrine was instituted as a policy of the US, both Greece and Turkey were facing communist insurgencies. So he made this doctrine and supported Greece and Turkey against communist revolutionaries within their borders. So these are very important ideas to keep in mind throughout the entire Cold War. This is America's policy. This is how the Korean War starts. This is how the Vietnam War starts. The U.S. Concern was that communism not expand, and whenever it did, that was considered to be like a loss, like a bad thing that happened. So, and they would work trying to prevent the spread of communism, to contain it within its borders. And then whenever a state became communist, they would say, well, they're communists now, don't let anyone else become communist. Let's contain it. Let's not let it spread any further. So another development is done by 1947, the U.S. made what's called the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan is an economic rescue package where America sent money and aid and help to Europe to help rebuild Europe after the destruction of World War II. So as this picture shows, Europe is a mess. It's destroyed by bombs, by warfare, and they're trying to rebuild their economies. And the Marshall Plan is saying, well, U.S. has a lot of money, a lot of resources. U.S. was not really directly bombed by anyone during World War II, except for Pearl Harbor and a few other random attacks in California, but really nothing significant. So this aid package, everywhere, so look at the map again, everywhere you see an asterisk, that's a country that got help with the Marshall Plan, with the U.S. giving them money. And this really was very, very successful. The money that they got from the Marshall Plan, they used to reinvest money in their economy, and they rebuilt very, very quickly, much faster than expected. And then the Soviet Union refused help, though. The Marshall Plan was offered to Eastern European countries, but the Soviets made sure that that offer was rejected. Notice, by the way, Spain did not get help for the Marshall Plan. That's because Spain is a fascist government. Remember, in the 1930s, Spain had a civil war, and the fascists won that, but they kind of sat out everything else. Spain is basically like a kind of a backwards fascist country that kind of sits out a lot of these big debates. They don't really, not a lot happens in Spain. They just kind of sit around and can't do much. So for the most part, though, the big debate, the big ideological warfare is between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, or between democracies and communists. And this begins, let's say, the war of ideology. So after the post-war, post-World War II, things changed. So during the war, it's the propaganda posters that they would make. So the U.S. had during World War II, say, this man is your friend. He fights for freedom. He's a Russian. The Russians are our friends. A lot of positive pro-Russian attitude in America during World War II. Same thing with the Soviets. Soviets have propaganda posters saying, the Americans are good. We're shaking hands with them. They're amazing. This is great. But after World War II, as distrust and disagreement grows between the two powers, it changes. So now Soviet propaganda is, okay, Americans are trying to offer help to us, but they're sneaky. They're trying to control us with their capitalist greed. And the communists will say, no, we don't want your help. We, let the people live. Long live the people against American aggression. American propaganda also changes. So they're saying, look, the Marshall Plan is good. The Russians don't want to help anybody. They're bad now. And the Marshall Plan is helping Europe, lifting Europe up. This is I believe it's a German, or it might be a Dutch. I can't read it actually. Anyway, so propaganda changes. And the war, if the Cold War is anything, it is a war of ideology, of trying to show the world which system is better, a free capitalist democracy or a communist dictatorship. So looking now, one of the major propaganda wins for the U.S. early on was the Berlin airlift. So what happened was Germany, in post-war Germany, it looked like this. Now, Germany was all one country. So you see the borders here, Germany was all one. But as the Allies entered into Germany, the Soviets took over this part, The British took over this part, Americans this part, French this part. So there's like different zones of operation. Now, when the war was over, the Allies are saying, yeah, we should put Germany back together again. But they each have very different visions on how it should go. The Allies here would like a democratic Germany, and the Soviets want a communist Germany, and they really cannot agree on how that should go. So to further complicate matters, Berlin itself is divided into zones. So you see in the picture there, this is Berlin. It's surrounded by the Soviet-controlled Germany. And Berlin has west and east. There's a French zone, British zone, American zone. And the Soviets say, hey, you guys should get out of Berlin. They say, no, we agreed to stay here. So there's a debate between them on how this should happen. I think it's very tense. What generally happens is the Allies, these allies, democratic countries, they decide that they'll let their part of Germany be its own country. So this is a map you get after this. So on this side, you have the Federal Republic of Germany. This is a democratic, capitalist Germany. The Soviets, for their part, they set up a communist regime in East Germany. And notice that the issue is that Berlin is still, the western half of Berlin is still in the Allied hands, and they just make that part of West Germany. Well, the Soviets don't like that. They say, well, we don't want this capitalist democracy right in the middle of our territory. So they say this should be part of the German Democratic Republic as communist state. And then there's a disagreement about this. Eventually, the Soviets blockade West Berlin. They say no food or anything gets in. No trucks can come in, no trains with supplies. And the idea is to starve them into submission to the Soviet rule. The response, though, what America does is they do what's called the Berlin Airlift, where they send hundreds of flights from West Germany to the airport in West Berlin, giving supplies, coal for keeping themselves warm. This lasts for about a year, with hundreds of flights take place where they supply West Germany with food and supplies. Now, this looks very bad on the Soviets' part because they look like they're starving people, and the Americans are giving them food. And so in the end, the Soviets say, enough of this blockade, let's just open supplies up again. So as the decades go on, you have Berlin divided into West and East, and this is actually part of this country. So there's two separate countries with a part of a country inside this country. It's pretty complicated. And what the Germans do as well is that the East Germans set up a wall separating East and West Berlin because they wanted to be clear that they're separate entities. And also they had an issue of Germans fleeing away from the communist regime into the West Berlin area. That way they can get asylum and try to join West Germany, which the communists did not want to happen. So Berlin Airlift. This is one of the major propaganda victories of democracies against communists early on. Containment seemed to be working. By 1948, it seemed like this was a good idea, like a good policy. It made the Soviets back.